Hello Evergreen Athletes, it is your favourite, most insufferable coach, Finlay here, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about how to build muscle, particularly how to build muscle after the age of 30, and particularly about how to build muscle in relation to performing athletically, running for distance, running for speed, playing sports. Now, this was going to be the Q&A, but I think everyone was just a little bit too busy with what was going on, so it is now I'm going to go through a number of questions on here, but obviously not an interactive environment. Within this episode, I'm really going to go through how does muscle influence the various things that are important to us. What is muscle? I'm going to be going a little bit into the anatomy and the physiology, because I think if you can understand those key elements, then all of a sudden you can kind of work it backwards from your program and figure out why are we doing this particular exercise? Why are the sets and reps like this? Why is the amount of volume like this? That will all start to connect rather than it being just like what if. I'd almost think about it as just being able to derive it back to its original source. I'm going to be giving you some really practical stuff on how do you increase it, and this again I hope that will help you connect the dots on specific elements of your training program and what's going on there, and even have some own answers to it and be able to, so you can make some small adaptations and changes on the fly if you need to. And then the last big section I'm going to be talking about the amplifiers and the suppressors of building muscle, because a bit like when someone's trying to lose weight, often people say it's 95% in the kitchen or what you do outside of it. Look, there is a very large influence of our broader lifestyle, our broader health, and how that can affect our ability to grow muscle. So it's good to have elements and levers that you're able to critique and be able to pull if you need to. But I would say that for quite a large majority of the people listening to it, you may want to change your body composition. That might be to lose some body weight and be able to change literally the shape of your body. That might be to increase your body weight and increase the amount of muscle that you have. And I would say that muscle is going to be one of the fastest levers that you can pull when you have this particular goal. And it is also going to be one of the most adaptable ones, because if we're trying to lose body fat, for example, our body is going to pull fat to when we're in a calorie deficit and use that for fuel and largely burn it off, for lack of a better word. But you're not going to be able to specifically pick out where that's coming from in your body, and people call it spotting weight, and that is very difficult for someone to do, if not completely impossible. However, if we flip it over to building muscle, then that is actually really pliable and adaptable. If I wanted to be able to grow the size of my shoulders, I can definitely go in and I can lift a hell of a lot of weights and to grow my deltoids, and I can make a really significant change to that. And you can be very specific and very targeted about different areas of your body, whether it's in your arms, your legs, your calves, whatever that is. If we have skeletal muscle mass there, it is extremely pliable to stimulus and changing. So that's a good thing to think about when you are maybe wanting to make changes, again, depending on what you have on the horizon. I think another element is that we want to be active. We want to be able to use our bodies for activities, whether it is playing with kids, whether it is entering events, whether it is helping around the house, moving objects, picking things up. And skeletal muscle mass is really the foundation of that, because on a very crude level, our brain is going to send a signal through our central nervous system. It's going to go into the muscles. It's going to contract. That's going to pull on tendon, pull on bone, and that's what is going to move our body. And people often think about, muscle is just for the bodybuilders or the strength and power sports, but we are contracting muscle when we're running repeatedly and running far. That is an absolutely vital part of it. It's just a slightly different lens that we're looking through. And if we talk specifically about running athletes or sport in general, when we have good control of our muscle, when we have good quality muscle, and we have a preferred distribution of the different types of muscle fibers within the muscles, we are going to be able to move more economically. We're going to be able to expend a little bit less energy, and we're going to have better control so we can perform at a much higher level in our specific sports. And then I think this might just be burrowing away at the back of a couple of people's heads at the moment, but if you are over the age of 30 and all of a sudden you have checked and thought, oh my God, I'm not the youngest person in the room anymore, you may be becoming aware of your longevity and looking after your health for the long term. And there is a slightly frightening stat that flies around, is that after the age of 30 we lose 3 to 8% of our muscle mass per decade. And that gradually increases, and that rate of loss increases as we get older, and really, I suppose, falls off a cliff at 60, 65, 70, and the rate increases exponentially. So that can sound quite defeatist and nihilistic, that's going to happen to us, but realistically we have an incredible amount of control to be able to either increase our muscle, mitigate and reduce that decrease if we do something about it. And obviously, if anyone probably listening to this or within the Evergreen Athlete, then you are doing something about it, and that's the kind of person that you are. But there are lots of people that bury their head and actually do nothing about it until they're in their later life. So those are probably some key things or reasons why muscle matters, for lack of a better word. But let's go on to what is muscle. But we've really got two different types of muscle. We've got our skeletal muscle and we've got our smooth muscle. We're going to talk a lot about skeletal muscle, but smooth muscle is it's our cardiac muscle. It's the muscle that's woven into our organs to help them contract and relax autonomously without us having to consciously think about it like we would if we were doing a bicep curl. We don't have as much control over the changes that they can make, and we don't really want to have that much control over it. They can still change. For example, one of the reasons that we become more aerobically fit is that our heart becomes better at pumping blood around the body by becoming bigger and stronger. And that is an incredibly important adaptation that takes a long period of time for our body to happen. But what we're really talking about is skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle is the largest organ that we have in our body. I think previously people used to think it was your skin, which is also fairly large, but the skeletal muscle has, in the last, I think, 10 to 15 years, been recognized as an organ that has a two-way processing. It's not just like a one-way brain tells muscle to contract and it does something, but it is evolved more broadly in, I suppose, like chemical pathways and hormonal changes. So it's a really vital part of our body, and a little bit, as I spoke about earlier, it is the most adaptable organ that we've got in our body. We can make a really significant change to our muscle, which can have a lot of downstream positive effects on our health. And from my understanding, from listening to a really great podcast actually by a guy called Andy Galpin, who's a good muscle physiologist, was saying that there is no known limit to the amount of muscle that we can have that then has a negative effect on our health. It can exponentially get better, but there are some perceived and semi-realistic limits to the amount of muscle that we can have without pumping ourselves full of drugs. But we still want to be able to maximise what we can get. Again, completely relevant to whatever task or sport or activity that you're working towards. So how is muscle formed? So I don't think I've mentioned it already, but we'll commonly talk about our muscles as like the quadriceps or the biceps or the triceps. Now what we want to be aware of is that these are groups of muscles. And another really great analogy that I heard from Andy Galpin was that thinking about the groups, the way that muscles are formed in its kind of Russian doll style way is that they are almost like the braids of hair. So you've got your individual hair strands, which would be your muscle fibers. You have when all the hairs are connected together and woven, which would be, I don't know if that's a braid, that would be our muscle. And then when they are collected in clusters, that is actually the finished product of your hairstyle. So they are, again, almost like these bundles of tissues all woven together with connective tissue, some fascia, some tendon that all kind of weaves together. And then eventually that connective tissue comes to an end, forms a tendon and attaches onto your bones. And that is what, when contracted, kind of pulls on the bone and influences your movement. Now, compared to a lot of other cells within our body, which only typically have one nucleus, the muscle fibers can have hundreds within them. And that means that basically we've got lots of different receptors from the different changes that happen to our body to then influence further change to the muscle, which is probably one of the reasons why it is so adaptable. Now, we do have different types of muscle fibers. I mentioned this earlier. We've got slow twitch and fast twitch, which can sometimes be known as a type 1, slow twitch, or a type 2 fiber, fast twitch. We then also have two subcategories of type 2 fibers, which would be a type A, which would be like a oxidative glycolytic, and that's a bit of jargon that I'll explain in a moment, and the type 2B, or the type 2X as it's sometimes known as, would be a glycolytic or a fast glycolytic muscle fibre. So what is the key difference between a slow and a fast one? A slow twitch muscle fibre is incredibly fatigue resistant. So we are able to use it repeatedly at low levels without it reducing its capacity to keep working. Imagine it like the diesel engine of muscle fibres, compared to our type 2A fibres, which would be a bit of a hybrid between the slow twitch and also the fast twitch, leaning more towards the fast, hence why it is in that broader category. So these are great for tasks like a 400-metre run, for example, or anything that's kind of like 30 seconds to a minute, a bit longer. These are the kind of tasks that these muscle fibres thrive at, producing a fairly high amount of force, but also being able to hold it for a period of time. And I would consider these as like the petrol engines of the muscle fibre world. And then what we've got lastly is we've got our type 2X muscle fibres, and these are the fast, explosive, aggressive muscle fibres. They fatigue and run out of fuel extremely quickly, and I am just pulling this analogy out of my head right now, but I would consider these as like the electric cars. So they can get off the line exceptionally fast, but the battery drains really quickly compared to something like a petrol or a diesel engine. So those are our main different types of fibres, and within each specific muscle in our body, we have a blend of these muscle fibre types at all times. And our body quite cleverly understands the types of tasks that it is required to do, and what type of distribution of muscle fibres it is going to need naturally, and then when we train it, it will adapt and evolve over time as well. So just to give you a very broad example, if we think about the calf complex around this area, we've got two main muscles that people know about, which is the gastrocnemius and we have the soleus. The gastrocnemius, if you were watching a rear view of people taking off into a 100-metre sprint, then that is the large kind of pointy shaped looking muscle that you're going to see when they're pushing off into the ground, where you've got their running spikes. And then the soleus is almost like a thinner layer, but it's like beneath it, and it is more for stabilizing, dissipating forces. So when we land against the ground, being able to cope with those, and it is keeping us upright, walking-based activities. And when we look at the fibre type distribution between those two muscles, the soleus typically has a much higher proportion of slow twitch muscle fibres, because its main role in the body is stabilising, walking, standing up, staying upright, and these tasks are things that we do all day. Secondly, a bit of balance also as well, which is like small micro movements. Whereas when we look at the gastrocnemius, the gastroc, that muscle is typically going to have much more fast twitch muscle fibres in it. It's for explosively pushing off. It's changing pace, accelerating, changing different directions. So our body already kind of understands what is required of it, and then when it comes to training athletically, it's up to us how we influence it. And again, our body is very pliable. There is definitely an element of genetics within it, and sometimes people have hypothesized of like why certain runners are so much faster than others, and they might just have a higher distribution of fast twitch muscle fibers. But also on the flip side, there are some very well-known case studies of athletes who have had muscle biopsies at different phases of their life and are naturally slow twitch, but have transitioned into these very big, powerful, fast twitch athletic people. I think that the genetic element of the fibre type distribution probably doesn't matter quite as much as the genetic element of your central nervous system, or even actually just the nurture elements of your early upbringing and the kind of activities that your body has been predisposed to. Like, as a very colloquial example, if you come up against someone that's perhaps played rugby from a very young age and they're used to tackling and hitting and doing things aggressively and powerfully, and they've also been exposed to lifting weights in the gym, sometimes at later life these people will seem to have like kind of superhuman strength compared to the layman. So to go back to those different muscle fibre types, another couple of key things that you need to learn about them is that the reason our slow twitch muscle fibers are fatigue resistant is that they have a better ability to use fat as a fuel and oxidize it through something called lipolysis, I think, and turn that into ATP, which then gets the muscle to contract, or certainly gives it the energy to contract. They also typically have more capillaries, so that is what allows the blood to kind of like diffuse and get your oxygen into there to then create that. So they will typically have higher levels of those compared to a fast twitch muscle fiber, which is better at using glycogen or carbohydrates for energy, but also when it does that and it converts it into energy, the waste products are a lot higher. So the fatigue that someone experiences is often a depletion of resources, but also an increase in the amount of fatiguing products that are building up inside them. So when you think of what the difference between aerobic and anaerobic, it's commonly known as aerobic is with oxygen and anaerobic is without oxygen, but realistically aerobic is with fat and anaerobic is with carbohydrates. And if we train for an endurance event, we're typically trying to get our body better at creating type 1 muscle fibers broadly, using fat for fuel and oxidizing it, which is sometimes why there's a bit of controversy about ketogenic diets and for athletic performance, but that's a totally different topic, because it is so fatigue resistant and we can do it for an extended period of time. Now with both of them, if we're trying to train it and convert it, whatever way we're trying to go, it does take time. That's ultimately our body is trying to change, and it's going to go through many evolutions to be able to do that. One of the last couple of things I'm going to talk about on this more like anatomy part is motor units. So our muscle fiber cannot be half on or half off. It's either on or off. And we are able to control movement and how much force that we apply by how many of those muscle fibers are working. Now we control by how many of those muscle fibers are working because we have neurons or nerve endings that are attached to clusters of muscle fibers, and that is called a motor unit. And effectively a signal comes from our brain, goes to a motor unit, it activates a cluster of them, and depending on how many clusters or how big or how many muscle fibers that motor unit is in control of will depend on how big the amount of force that comes out and we are using. So there are various different ways of looking at it. Like, we will have motor units that are in areas of perhaps our fingers or our eyes, where we need very fine control of our body, where we're not going to be wanting to activate everything and make massive big changes in our movement, and that's only going to have a few fibers or muscles, clusters within it. Whereas in bigger, more powerful areas of our body, our glutes, our quads, our pecs, we're more likely to have motor units that are connected to many, many more fibers and able to switch them on when we need it. And a big part of getting stronger, which is not really the topic of today, but is our body's ability to switch on those big motor units and get them working when we want to. And if anyone, this is a bit nerdy, but if anyone has been on a force plate where you test your maximal strength, you'll often see the amount of force that you output is just gradually increasing like this, and it becomes this arc. And basically, rather than just our body switching on everything and going vertically to 100% and holding, it's learning that it requires more and more motor units to be switched on, which is how we gradually increase the amount of force that we're producing over time. If you think about, I think of a nice analogy, if I go into the kitchen and I'm trying to pick up a large bottle of something, or perhaps a kettle that I cannot see how much water is inside of it. I might go up thinking that there's a lot of water on it and lift it up and almost like throw it over my shoulder because I've completely misjudged how many motor units I require to pick up that kettle. Alternatively, I might go up and try and give it a little bit and go, oh God, this is nowhere near enough, and I've got to put more effort in. And that's a very real bit of feedback on your body learning how many motor units it needs to require, or how many muscle fibers it's going to need to turn on to achieve the task if it can. Okay? So that's pretty much how we learn how to do it. And when people talk about use it or lose it, like that is a real thing. And I mentioned at the very beginning of this, being able to preserve the amount of muscle and what we can do with it, we do know that we lose power, which is basically our body's ability to switch on lots of muscle fibers and activate them quickly, faster than we lose muscle and that we lose strength. And I believe there is research that has been shown that our body can de-innervate, so basically those motor unit connections to the muscle can kind of almost like dry up and fuck off, and then we are unable to get that back if we don't use it. I don't think that's going to be enormously prevalent for anyone listening to this podcast at their age, but it can happen if we don't do anything about it. So we want to be conscious of that, and that's why just that drip feeding of strength and training to build muscle over your lifetime is an incredibly important part. We've got a pretty good understanding, I hope, of what's going on, what our muscles are, how do they activate, what different types of muscles we got there. You're probably wondering, how the hell do I actually get more of them or make them bigger? And those are two separate things. There is hyperplasia, which is the growth of new muscle fibers and is, I believe, slightly controversial and one of these more of a theoretical things rather than something that's been proven. If there are any other coaches listening to this and you have some good evidence of that, I would love to know about it. And then there's hypertrophy, which is increasing the size or the diameter of muscle fibers that already exist. And hypertrophy has been extensively researched and shown to happen. In essence, when the muscle fiber increases in diameter, almost again at the layer below that, we have something called myofibrils, which occupy it, and we get more of them within that muscle fiber. And within those myofibrils are like these, it's called a myosin and an actin, but basically like a head and something to hang on to, and they are the two elements that grab onto each other and pull themselves toward each other, which contracts a muscle at its very, very smallest level. So when we hypertrophy and increase the number of myofibrils, we are increasing the number of myosin actin heads, which give us more elements to be able to pull to it together. So I believe that one of the questions that someone came back with was, can you increase strength without increasing muscle, and kind of vice versa? And is it, or a rephrasing of that would be, when you increase muscle, are you always increasing strength? And realistically, the answer is no, but there is overlap. Typically, when we start lifting weights, and I'm kind of on a bit of a detour with this question right now, our strength will increase very rapidly. That is normally because our body is getting better at activating those motor units, amongst other things. It's not necessarily about us hypertrophying the muscle and increasing the number of myofibrils within the muscle fiber. Over time, when those neural benefits start to wane or diminish, the more of our strength gains will come from increasing the amount of muscle that we have, or increasing the size of our muscles. So there is a relationship. It's not perfect. I think it's a broad thing. If you are looking at someone who has a lot of muscle, I would assume that they're probably pretty strong, and vice versa. But you always get anomalies. You get some people that have incredibly well-functioning neuromuscular systems are able to activate, not 100%, but a high proportion of what they already have. So that's the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia. We're really pushing towards hypertrophy, and there are various different methods that have been described to stimulate a muscle hypertrophy. So I want you to think about going to the gym or doing a training session as the stimulus, the catalyst, the thing that's changing, that's creating change within our body so that we can grow muscle. We've kind of got a couple of processes. We stimulate it, then we've got almost like the kind of chemical reactions that are going on with our body. And then the last element is like the things that are going to upregulate or downregulate those processes to make it all happen. Because we want muscle protein synthesis. So when we stimulate the muscle, and I'm going to talk about exactly how we do that, we want to set off a cascade called muscle protein synthesis, which is then going to get the proteins, shockingly enough, to then build muscle, which is also one of the reasons why eating from protein is quite useful. So how do we do that in practice? We need to do resistance training, all right? Shock horror. But the reason I've used the word resistance training and not lifting weights is that we can find resistance from everywhere. And this is probably, I think, a key bugbear when I find that people or coaches or anyone in the health industry get enormously attached to a specific implement, a specific method, it doesn't really fucking matter. Like whether you are doing yoga and you are using your body for resistance, or you are doing calisthenics and you're still using your body but probably off the ground, or you are using barbells or kettlebells, the specific method that we get the resistance doesn't really matter to our body. Our muscle does not look at a kettlebell and go, oh, well, that's it. It is thinking about the amount of force that is required to use that particular implement. Like I typically would say that we're going to just alter the types of training that we do over our life course depending on the task that we're working towards and depending on the changes that have happened to our body. So again, someone might come and start with me and they would be doing a lot of body weight exercises, but over a period of time, once your muscle is adapted, that's not going to be enough to stimulate new muscle growth, because you're going to either need to do a fuckload of reps to get there, or and you're not going to have enough time in your day, or it's just not going to be enough of a stimulus to start that cascade of muscle protein synthesis. So we need to find resistance from somewhere. And what the resistance does is it creates something called mechanical tension. So you can try and picture this out right now. When we are moving a weight, for an example, and we are trying to move it quickly, but our body is fatigued and the weight is heavy, then that movement will slow down. So we'll be trying to move it as fast as we can, but we almost can't. It's that grinding rep that we're going through. And what that does is, when you take it right back to the myofibrils, is that our myosin and actin heads are holding on to each other for a prolonged period of time, creating tension on the muscle. And that has been found to be the key stimulus to growing muscle. There have been other ones of like trying to increase the pump and the amount of like kind of blood flow that goes in there, and a few other, one other different type. But rather than confuse you with those, we've basically found that is the most important factor when it comes to increasing the amount of muscle we have and starting that cascaded process. So this is sometimes called a stimulated rep. So a stimulated rep is one where there is very high mechanical tension. So how would you know that there's going to be high mechanical tension? As I mentioned earlier, the first thing, it'll slow down even though you're trying to do it quickly. The second one is your body will probably try to change the technique that you're doing because the muscle fibers that it's trying to activate are not enough to get the tasks done. So your body's going, right, shit, I need to get a little bit from this zone over here and help me out over here. And it'll change the technique that we're doing to just achieve the task and either get itself to safety and back to where we are. That would be the second thing. And the third thing is your body's going to go, shit, this is getting really hard. And your brain is going to be sending signals to you saying like, hey, this is getting quite hard right now. We should probably stop what we're doing and maybe change things up. So we want to be aware of when that's happening. We need to not be afraid of it happening. We need to lean into it and see how many repetitions we can get there. And this is going to come on to a key, really important thing. If you take anything away from that, it's how close we are to failure when we can't do any more reps that is going to influence the amount of muscle hypertrophy that we get. Okay? So that means that if I do a set of 12 or I do a set of 5, and I get 3 hard stimulated reps in either rep range, I'm going to get a very, very similar amount of muscle growth from them. So that is why I use reps in reserve quite a lot right now. It's very practical, but also because of that need to build muscle. That's why it's a good way of prescribing intensity when you are particularly trying to get hypertrophy from someone. It also is very relative to your particular strength levels and how elastic they are and how they'll change and go up and down as you start to develop. Now, this is also a key reason why jumping does not typically build muscle. So if we're producing a lot of force when we're jumping, you might think that, that will build some muscle for us. Now, it doesn't, because there is not enough mechanical tension. It's happening so fast, and it's happening over a short period of time, that they're not holding on for a very long period of time, and therefore that process of muscle protein synthesis is typically not started or catalyzed as we go on. That's also a reason why, if you are doing a tempo exercise, and it is a lightweight, let's say it is a body weight squat, and I'm saying go down for 5, go back up for 5, like I'm purposely slowing the exercise down prior to my body needing to slow it down because it can't move fast. And those reps are not going to be stimulating muscle growth, okay? And there have been some studies that have looked at the amount of time that people go for a tempo or a lengthening phase, and again, we want to keep that below 5 seconds. Going above it is not going to increase the amount of muscle hypertrophy that we're producing. So we need to push our body close to failure, close to fatigue, so that we can stimulate that and we can get closer to the reps in reserves. So how many reps in reserve do we need to go to start stimulating muscle growth? And is there a cut-off if we're doing too little? The closer we are to failure, the better. But that does come with a cost that I'll talk about in a moment. But also, we still get a really good stimulus when we are at 5 reps in reserve, 4 reps in reserve, and 3 reps in reserve. So I wouldn't underestimate that and feel like you need to completely mess yourself up on every single set to be getting maximum hypertrophy. Because yes, if you did that in isolation, that's great, but what is the cost? The cost is that you're too fatigued to turn up the next day. You're pushing yourself continually towards kind of micro trauma in the body, and it's unable to recover fast enough to repair and get back there, because that is another part of the equation. So hence that's why you'll see in programs it might be like week 1 is 4 reps in reserve, week 2 is 3, week 3 is 2, and so it goes down. We build up that intensity over a block of period of time, and then we drop it back down, and you have a chance to recover and build up again. Because again, increasing the amount of muscle is not going to happen overnight. This is something that's going to take 8, 12, 16 weeks, and the fitter and the more adapted you are to that, the bigger the stimulus is that you're going to need to get there. So if we want to play a little bit of defense as well as playing that offense. Now, people actually have looked at, and this gets a little bit statistical, and I'm be honest, that's not my strong point, but if you are working on that 0 to 3 reps in reserve, the effect size can be 0.38, so that's a moderate, kind of effect there. Whereas if you're working from the 4 to the 6 reps in reserve, it's 0.26. So that's about a 15-20% difference going on there, which is fairly big. But also, you're still getting a change no matter whether you're working at 6 reps in reserve or you're working at 3 reps in reserve. And if someone is coming in after a period of time of off training, or you are within the first few years of training to increase muscle and improve strength, then you're still going to get a really big effect anyway because the stimulus is so large. So that's kind of how hard we want to be working. We also want to be thinking about how much we should be doing. And again, this is a topic that has had a lot of research in it, and this is looked at of the number of sets of exercise you need to be doing per muscle group. If you want to think about trying to increase the amount of muscle that you have, again, I'll use your shoulders, your deltoids. We need to be doing more than 5 sets per week. And when it starts to get into the really big changes, that's at 10 or more sets per week. And I believe it does start to taper off and the returns start to diminish when people are getting towards 20 sets per week. So that let's actually put that into like a practical program. If I'm doing, again, I'll use shoulder press for an example right now. If I do some dumbbell shoulder press on a Tuesday and I do 3 sets of 10 and I get approximately 3 reps in reserve, and I'm getting about 3 or 4 stimulated reps per set, and I do a second bout of shoulder press, let's say I do a different variation, I use a barbell this time, or I use a single arm, and I do another 3 sets, then you're getting a really adequate amount of stimulus and volume in your training to make that change over time. And what you'll find over time, and I've got a few clients that I can think of right now who get really annoyed at me when I program 4 or 5 sets of activity, because it can take up a bit of time, but take that as a bit of a compliment. Like, I'm trying to get more of a stimulus from you because you are very well adapted to the training and you need a higher volume to be able to increase the amount of muscle hypertrophy that you're getting. So we want to be thinking about that, and that's something that we track over time, plotting how many sets in particular phases that we are working through. So it might be like, right, we want 5 sets of chest, we want 10 sets of set on your quads, we want 6 sets on your hamstring, and loosely looking at that as we go through it. And that, as a bit of an overlap, my opinion, that is why exercise technique is important, is because we're stopping movement in certain joints and we are increasing movement in other joints so that we can work and we can stretch those particular muscles and either get the hypertrophy that we need or the strength that we need. Whereas if everything is a bit loose and floppy and lacking consistency, then you're not quite as confident that you're going to be getting the hypertrophy changes to that particular area of your body. So that's how much we should do. And this is where everything kind of comes down to progressive overload, which becomes almost a bit of a meme. But every single different training technique that someone is using with you is about progressively overloading the body, because our body likes being comfortable. It likes something called homeostasis. It likes being normal. And when we stress it by training, it goes into a phase of alarm and recovery where it can't perform as well as it could before. And because it doesn't want to experience that same stress as it did then, it recovers and adapts, builds more muscle so that the next time it has to do that same task, it's not nearly as stressful on the body. And that continual wave-like function is what we're trying to do with our body. And then the different levers that we're pulling, whether it is how much of the exercises we're doing, how difficult it is, the particular type of exercises, which is just another way of changing intensity, is really how we're trying to progressively overload that body over time, which I suppose falls onto another important element of it. Like, training stress is more like a drip, drip, drip approach, because we can't just dump an enormous amount of stress in our body and expect to get an immediate change. It needs time and repeated efforts to be able to go there. And the way the analogy I've come up with this is, imagine you're listening to a song. Like, a song is going to have an introduction, it's going to have a verse, it's going to have a chorus, and then it's going to rotate through that. And I think your training is, sorry, my partner is in the corner smiling at me at this analogy, which is a good fucking analogy, and I'm keeping this bit in the podcast, is if we just go in and we blast the chorus repeatedly, it's boring. Our body becomes numb, it's overloading, you don't want to do that all the time, it's not very enjoyable to listen to. We want to go through these stages of, like, gradually getting the body ready, doing a pronounced amount of work, which would be the verse, and then hitting it with some intensity, which is the chorus. And that variation that goes through those different training phases is another element that continues to overload the body over time. And I'm going to stop there, I'm going to come back. Okay, team, welcome back. I took a little impromptu break there, I think, after making the analogy of training being like a song. It was probably time to tap out for just a few minutes. But no, we're back. And actually, I do hope that analogy sticks with everyone. But what we've covered so far, and everyone should have a fairly good idea, is, like, how are we stimulating new muscle growth? Where are we getting resistance from? What a stimulated rep is? How are we going to progressively overload it? And how much volume we're required to be able to make those incremental changes. And I would say that the next element is, if we've got all of these different factors that are kind of floating around, now we really want to step into how are we bringing this in to create your training split, or your weekly microcycle, which would be called in training science. But a training split is much more of an easy way. And all it really is a way of putting these different units of your training, putting them throughout the week to be able to manage fatigue, manage fitness, and to be able to extract as much of whatever the top priority is for you at that point in time. So some common ones would be like the bro split, and I'll go through all these in a little bit more detail, a push-pull split, or an upper-lower split. Those are some basic ones when it comes to when your only goal is building muscle. But obviously, when it comes to integrating that with sports performance as well, we want to be considering when are the higher intensity training sessions? When are you doing any sprints? When do you have any high threshold running in your training sessions? When do you have any extensive training that's going to be creating some fatigue? Because in essence, we just want to be able to balance the week so that you have adequate recovery and you are able to perform at the best level possible for your big days, and you are able to recover adequately between them, so that you can keep that momentum going for a long period of time. So like a bro split, this is like one of the reasons that this is such a quintessential bodybuilding split is because you are doing maximum amount of volume and training in one training session, creating as much mechanical tension as you possibly can. And that can have quite a large inflammatory response in the 24 and 48 hours subsequent to training. And if you're dosing it, if you're getting all 10 to 15 or to 20 sets of your training for pecs or chest in that one training session, it can take an extensive amount of time for that to be able to recover and to be able to go again. And you need to be able to actually then fit in if you're doing such a large stressful stimulus on that one day, you then need to try and figure out how can you fit everything else in your week. So that's why that split has kind of come about, which would be like, for an example, Monday would be chest, Tuesday would be back, Thursday might be legs, Wednesday might be legs, Thursday might be shoulders, and then you might do abdominals and arms on a Friday. And you're just kind of segmenting the different body parts of your body over 5 days. Then when it comes to a push and a pull, this is really more about a movement pattern. So anytime that you are pushing a weight away from your center of mass, such as a bench press, or if you're doing a squat, you're clustering those exercises into one session, and then you're doubling it and you're repeating it. So it might be like push Monday, pull Tuesday, rest Wednesday, pull, push Thursday, pull Friday. So what you're doing is you're able to hit the same muscle groups twice, but the likelihood is that you're doing a smaller dose of each muscle group in the training sessions. And then when it comes to upper lower, it's a very similar thing. You go upper on a Monday, lower on a Tuesday, upper on a Thursday, lower on a Friday. That's really not too much of a difference than when you're doing the push-pull splits. And why would you use those splits compared to a bro split? I think that you would use those when you are leaning a little bit more to generating general strength and maximal strength alongside that. You might also do it on the flip side if you are a more advanced hypertrophy trainer where you have quite a significant amount of time. Let's say you've got an hour and a half to 2 hours per session to train, then you're going to get double the dose and you'll be able to fit in all of your sets in those training sessions and continue to stress the body further. But it's quite a case-by-case example, and I'll be honest, there's no training split that is superior to another one. It's more about what's convenient for you, and how many training opportunities do you have that are rock solid and locked in? How many that are a bit more variable, as in like you'd love to be able to train 5 days a week, but it's not always possible. And that's going to influence your training split quite heavily. And that's often why something like a body part or a bro split doesn't work for everyone, because you just cannot make the gym consistently 5 days a week. So one part of your body continually gets neglected. It's just about looking at these different fatigues, and another way that you can look at it is like high day, low day, high day, low day, high day, low day throughout your week. What is hard, what is low, and that comes into prevalence when you're, particularly when you're juggling lots of different stimulus. If you're a runner, I think this is a really good time to then move on to the third section of this, what's becoming quite a large podcast episode on building muscle, and that's going to be amplifiers and suppressors. And I think this is if you are an athlete who is, again, almost playing any sport, and you are juggling different stimulus and you're trying to figure out, how do I build muscle and still perform at my sport? If I do build muscle, is it going to impact what's going on? Then this is going to be ideal for you. So in essence, if we are trying to improve multiple different things within our physical performance, let's say speed, you've got agility, you've got aerobic endurance, you might have lactate threshold, you've got building muscle, maximal strength, power, all of these different elements that might go alongside even the skill of improving your sport. This trying to improve multiple things at the same time is called concurrent training. It's been extensively researched, and it's gone through various phases of what people believe, and the science has evolved, which is a really good thing to test your knowledge against, because I do think that the best thing about science is that it can change and new evidence can come to light, and we need to be able to adapt our opinions alongside that. The biggest myth that will probably take a long time to dilute out is that you cannot train two things and they will impede each other. That is no longer deemed true in the scientific literature. So you can improve your aerobic energy system, and you can also build muscle in the same training block. You can do that to a very high level also. Previously, that was an absolute no-no, but we do know that if you are not training those same things in the same training session, then that will not dampen the effect. Sorry, that might be a bit of a clunky way of saying it. So in essence, if you're able to separate those two stimulus, you are training aerobically on a Monday morning and you're training to build muscle on a Monday evening, that is enough of a time difference to reduce any of the dampening effects or the problems that might occur. So initially, why did we think that that would cause problems? Primarily a kind of an interference effect. So basically when I've spoken previously in this podcast about creating a stimulus that then starts a cascade of things to signify protein synthesis, that is called the mTOR process. And I'm not going to name every step because I don't know it, but that is a key one for in generating new muscle tissue, okay? Whereas, or aerobically, it's called the AMPK. And again, that is just a different pathway. Now, what we have a fairly good idea is if you're trying to work one pathway, they don't really work together. But we did think that you needed much longer between them. And what we know right now is that actually if you just separate these training sessions by 6 or more hours, that's not going to have as much of an interference effect, and you can still make really good gains at both of them. The problem is that it's more about allocation of resources. So thinking about it on like if you were running a company, if you are allocating 100% of your resources towards marketing, you're pretty sure that marketing is going to improve. And it's the same in performance. If you're allocating 100% of your resources towards improving your aerobic energy system and you are taking it away from other places, it's going to have the biggest improvement. And that is pretty easy to understand, but the reality of training for a sport, even if it is an endurance running sport, is you still need lots of other things to make up that, and it's too much of a reductionist point of view to think that you can just work on one specific factor and your whole performance is going to improve. Even for a marathon runner, they need to be reactively strong. They need to be able to bounce off the ground. They need to be able to work at a high threshold. They need to have a bit of speed. They also need to have an aerobic energy system. They need to have muscles and tendons and ligaments that are able to cope with the high amount of training volume as well. So they're like, even in what would be classed as one of the most quintessential endurance sports out there, it's still a multifactorial sport underneath it. So in essence, you can train multiple modalities. It's the effect will be increased by the more that you do, but they can work together. And what we've got to think about building muscle as well is it's not just if it's relating to sports performance, it's not just about increasing the size of the muscle and for that only effect. Increasing muscle has a lot of downstream general health improvements. When you increase the muscle and you do emphasis hypertrophy, that can improve your tendon strength and stiffness. When you focus on muscle, it can also have positive effects on bone health and have increasing bone density. It can also help you manage your weight a lot better because you have more tissue that is able to soak up blood sugars, glucose into it, which is going to regulate your insulin levels a lot easier and make weight management that little bit easier too. So there are other benefits to building muscle outside of simply getting bigger muscles and looking like a fucking Adonis, if that's what you're into. So, and then next comes to nutrition, and it's obviously such a cliche coaching, personal training, strength and conditioning thing to say, but protein is important. And I kind of have a bit of a laugh to myself that I wonder whether all the big corporations are just looking at new products that they're bringing out and just flipping a coin to be like, should we put AI in this or do we put protein in it? Because it just seems to be in absolutely every single bit box on the whole planet at the moment. But when it does come to building muscle, having an adequate amount of protein is an important factor for multiple reasons. We need the resources to be able to build muscle. Like a common thing is like energy, which is what food is transferred. Energy cannot be created. So if we're bringing food in and we're trying to add mass to our body, it needs to come from somewhere. And the stimulus from training is really just to start the cascade. And then it's like, right, give me the resources to be able to make this. What we're typically looking for is anything from 1.1 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight. Now, that's such a wide open range. Now, I think a lot of the bickering that happens online about protein, about eating too much of it or not eating enough of it, comes from the interpretation of the statistics in kind of key research articles. And one of the most important ones talks about the confidence interval. And basically that means that we are pretty confident that if you eat more than 2.2 grams of protein, you're not going to experience further gains. But if you eat less than 1 gram of protein, that's not going to be enough. And they're basically saying that we are confident that if you sit between those two, for most people, that's going to be the best for them. But it's not saying that you need to eat specifically 2.2. It's not saying you need to eat specifically 1 gram. And often you'll find cited 1.6 grams because it basically just sits in the very middle between the two. And it's a safe bet for nutritionists and dietitians to go for. And I would echo that also. I do think on a slightly different slant is that you want to eat generally a high amount of protein because you need to be able to consume a high number of calories, and if you're only consuming them from other sources, it can sometimes blow out what you're eating. Carbohydrates are typically a little bit more calorie heavy, and it's quite easy to consume them, whereas if we consume a high amount of protein, it's a bit more difficult, it's a bit more satiating, and it costs our body a little bit more to be able to process it in the first place. The next thing when it comes to nutrition is a calorie surplus versus a calorie deficit. Now, interestingly enough, the research on this is not completely concrete. I think it's a fairly difficult scientific study to conduct. But if I refer back to the energy balance, then we are definitely needing some sort of surplus to be able to increase the amount of mass that we have. Now, it's a bit like losing weight in that, and Jack put it perfectly when we had the Q&A on nutrition, is that when we lose weight, we are not losing 100% of that from fat. We are losing a bit of muscle, a bit of water, a bit of glycogen, a bit of fat. It's like a pie chart, and we really don't know exactly how much of each of these different elements we're losing. It's almost exactly the same when we're trying to add weight as well. We're going to add a little bit of fat, we're going to add a bit of muscle, we're going to add a bit of water, and that is going to overall increase our total body mass. From some of the research that has come out, it does tend to show that if you are the higher the surplus that you are eating in, the greater the amount of body fat that you are going to be adding to your body in relation to everything else. So I typically encourage people to go between a 5 to 7.5% surplus, which is definitely something to watch out for if you are using an app that automatically gives you a 10% or 15% surplus, because that will definitely add weight to your body, but the proportion of it being lean muscle tissue or muscle tissue is going to be a little bit lower. So now here are two other things that really come into the importance of amplifying and also suppressing training. Now, I think a really nice quote that I heard from Greg Lehman, who's an interesting academic and researcher on when it comes to rehab, is that when he's looking at someone trying to rehab them, he's, aside from the specific injury and the protocols and the systems to help them there, he's also asking himself a question: how can I make this person in front of me a little bit healthier? Very broad, loose term, but I think this also applies to when you're trying to build muscle and you're training for performance. What other elements in your life could you change to generally increase your overall health? If you are a desk worker, do you think that just adding 30 minutes of walking per day would be a positive or a negative? It would be an absolutely massive positive. And so the two key things that I think we need to focus on is your sleep. This has obviously come to a lot of prominence lately in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, but there is some really interesting information that if you are lacking sleep, as in almost have none for a night, then your muscle protein synthesis can be suppressed by 18%. So nearly a fifth, and it's not doing as much. Your cortisol can increase by 21%, and your testosterone can drop by 24%. So these are significant changes to your hormones and the chemical pathways that are there to help you produce muscle. And the old phrase of flight or fight is very important here. Like, we are telling our body to invest resources to make more of us, to make us less economical in many respects to life. If we are in a continually depleted state, then our body is going to down-regulate that because it does not think it is a good idea to be using those resources from elsewhere, and it's going to use them for basic functions like supplying our organs. It's going to be just helping us stay awake during the day, and then survival instincts. There's always this constant resource management that's going on inside of us. And then the second one would be life load, which is often referred to as your allostatic load or allostatic load. I don't know, not great in pronunciation. And this is a broad overall term to be able to describe your total life load. And I think that's something that is going to be used more and more in the future across all domains, performance, rehab, whatever that is, because when people are talking about stressors that are taking place on someone, it's really difficult to separate them out. Like, your body knows what stress is. It can feel the stress that it feels from, missing a deadline or something bad happening in their life can also be comparable to a training stress that goes on it. So we think about it as like a total life load. You're never going to have no load at all going on. There's always going to be stuff there, and it's more about how you're managing that. So, for example, if you are extremely busy with work and you have very little time to recover, you're investing a lot of energy on that, it's probably not a good idea to be absolutely ramping up your training through the roof, and you're just doubling your total allostatic load and your training load going on there. We do have some evidence that's showing that when it comes to bench press and squat, this is more strength numbers, that it can reduce bench press improvement by a few percent, and it can reduce back squat improvement by a few percent, which on their own might not really look like a lot, but I guess when things are extrapolated out over weeks and months, this starts to become much more significant. So in essence, what we've got there is, if you can improve, make sure that you're in a calorie surplus, again, depending on whether you're trying to add weight or reduce weight. But if you're trying to add muscle, we want to be in a small calorie surplus. We want to be making sure that we're eating between 1 to 2.2 grams of protein per day. We want to make sure that our other training loads are managed, so that we're not doing things that are competing necessarily back to back or without some sort of gap within them. We want to do what we can to reduce our life load, or certainly just be aware of when it is increasing in other areas and start to reflect on how that might be impacting our physical performance. And if we're willing to take that risk and just keep pushing on regardless, but try not to be upset or downbeaten if the results are not following as you'd like them to, just accepting that that is just the case right now and it will not be forever. And then the last thing is sleep, which just is this overall thing of recovery. Like, we apply a stress to our body with the training. We need to give it time for it to go through the processes to be able to make the changes to our body that we need. Whew. Man alive, that was an absolute monster of a podcast. I normally struggle to talk for 20 minutes, but I think I've just spoken for over an hour there. Team, that was everything I know about building muscle. We went through quite a lot. I would love to hear your feedback on this. And if you are not already on the Evergreen Athlete team and you liked that in some manner and you are interested in working with me to be able to improve your athletic performance and become an absolutely jacked athlete, let me know.